Steve Jobs didn't just sell gadgets, he rewired how the world consumes reality. There was a time, gather around kids, when listening to music required commitment. Physical commitment, emotional commitment, sometimes even upper body strength. You had shelves, you had discs, you had that one CD case that refused to open unless you negotiated with it like a hostage situation. Music wasn't just something you heard, it was something you owned, scratched, lost, and occasionally melted in your car. And then along came Steve Jobs, looking at this entire system like it was a fax machine at a yoga retreat, completely out of place. Here's the setup: early 2000s. The music industry was in full panic mode. Napster had just kicked the door down, and suddenly everyone with dial-up internet was downloading songs like it was a digital buffet with no consequences. Record labels were suing teenagers, not metaphorically, literally. Somewhere, a 14-year-old was being dragged into court for downloading a Limp Bizkit song, which, frankly, might have been punishment enough. The industry had two strategies. One, pretend the internet didn't exist. Two, sue everyone who proved it did. Enter Steve Jobs with a third option. What if we made it easy? Now, this was revolutionary thinking. Not the technology, the thinking. Because before Jobs, the tech world had a weird obsession with making things complicated. You wanted to transfer music? Cool, here's a 12-step process, 3 cables, and software that looks like it was designed during a power outage. Jobs looked at that and said, no, 1 button, maybe 2. Let's not get crazy. So in 2001, Apple drops the iPod. And on paper, it doesn't sound like a revolution. It's just a small white device that holds music. But here's the twist. It actually worked the way humans expect things to work. Scroll, click, play, done. No manuals, no existential crisis, no calling your nephew to figure it out. But the real masterstroke wasn't the iPod itself. It was what came next. Because Steve Jobs didn't just want to give you a better way to listen to music, he wanted to completely replace how you got it. That's where iTunes enters the chat. Now, the music industry at this point was basically standing in the corner like a confused dad trying to use a remote control. They knew something was happening, but they had no idea what any of the buttons did. Jobs walks in and says, "Hey, what if people paid 99 cents per song?" And the entire industry collectively gasped like he just suggested selling oxygen. Because their model was built on forcing you to buy 12 songs just to get the one you actually wanted. You didn't want the album. Nobody wanted the album. You wanted that one track you heard on the radio while driving past a Taco Bell at 11 p.m. But no, you had to buy the whole thing, including track 7, which sounded like the band recorded it during a mild allergic reaction. Jobs saw that and thought, this is why people are pirating. Not because they're criminals, because they're annoyed. So he makes a deal with the labels. And this is where it gets interesting. Because convincing record executives to embrace digital distribution was like trying to explain Wi-Fi to a brick wall, a very expensive, very stubborn brick wall. But Jobs had leverage. Apple was cool. Apple was growing. And more importantly, Apple understood something the industry didn't. Convenience beats control. Every single time. People weren't pirating because they loved stealing. They were pirating because it was easier than buying music legally. That's not a crime problem. That's a user experience problem. So iTunes launches, clean interface, simple pricing, instant access. And just like that, music goes from something you physically own to something you casually collect like digital snacks. You're not buying albums anymore. You're buying moments, moods, impulses. Oh, I heard that song in a commercial. Click. I remember this from high school. Click. I don't even like this artist, but I'm emotionally vulnerable right now. Click. And the industry? They didn't collapse. They adapted, slowly, painfully, like a guy learning to use emojis for the first time. But here's the real twist. The thing nobody saw coming. Steve Jobs didn't just save the music industry. He changed what music is. Before iTunes, music was tied to objects, CDs, tapes, shelves. After iTunes, music became invisible, portable, infinite. It wasn't something you owned anymore. It was something that followed you. And that shift? That's the blueprint for everything that came after. Streaming, Netflix, Spotify. The entire concept of content on demand starts right here, with a guy who looked at a CD rack and thought, This is way too much plastic for one emotional breakdown. And the funniest part? The industry that once fought digital music like it was a home invasion now depends on it completely. They went from, "This will destroy us," to, "Please stream our entire catalog immediately," which is kind of Steve Jobs' signature move. He didn't invent music. He didn't invent digital files. He didn't even invent portable players. He just connected the dots in a way that made everyone else look like they were still using a flip phone in a touchscreen world. And just when you think that's impressive, that was just the warm-up. And just when the music industry was finally catching its breath, thinking, "Okay, we survived that one," Steve Jobs quietly looked at another giant, slow-moving, overconfident beast and thought, "Your turn." Because if turning music into invisible data was bold, what he was about to do next was borderline reckless, the kind of decision that either makes you a legend or gets you laughed out of Silicon Valley coffee shops for the rest of your life. And the target this time wasn't CDs or record labels. It was something far bigger, far older, and far more comfortable in its dominance. The mobile phone industry, which in the mid-2000s was basically a kingdom ruled by buttons, confusion, and a deep commitment to making simple tasks feel like filing taxes. You had phones with keyboards, phones with tiny joysticks, phones that flipped, slid, snapped, and occasionally seemed like they might transform into a small appliance if you pressed the wrong thing. And every single one of them came with a user interface that felt like it had been designed by someone who actively disliked humans. Texting required the patience of a monk and the finger precision of a surgeon. And if you wanted to browse the internet, congratulations. You were about to experience a version of the web that looked like it had been faxed through time. And yet, despite all of this, the industry thought things were going great. Companies like Nokia and BlackBerry were dominating. Executives were confident, secure, maybe even a little smug, because from their perspective, they had already solved the problem. People could call, text, maybe send an email if they were feeling adventurous. What more could anyone possibly want? And then Steve Jobs walks in, looks at this entire ecosystem, and does what he always did best. He ignores what exists and focuses on what's missing, and what's missing in his mind is something radical. Simplicity. Because while everyone else was competing on features, more buttons, more menus, more tiny, confusing options, Jobs was obsessed with removing things, stripping them away, asking the kind of question that sounds obvious only after someone else has already answered it. What if the phone had one button, which to the rest of the industry sounded insane? Not bold, not visionary, just flat-out ridiculous, because buttons were safety, buttons were structure, buttons were how users understood what to do. Taking them away would be like removing the steering wheel from a car and saying, "Don't worry, it'll figure itself out." But Jobs wasn't interested in making a better phone. He was interested in redefining what a phone even was. And this is where things get dangerous, because redefining categories is expensive, risky, and usually ends with someone writing a very thoughtful failure post on a blog nobody reads. But Jobs had something most companies didn't: a willingness to bet everything on being right about the future. And in 2007, he steps onto a stage and delivers what might be the most theatrical product launch in business history. Not because of flashy graphics or dramatic music, but because of the way he framed it. He didn't say, "Here's a new phone." He said, "Today, Apple is going to reinvent the phone," which is the corporate equivalent of walking into a crowded room and announcing you're about to change gravity. And then he builds the tension, slowly, methodically, like a magician who knows the trick only works if the audience leans in. An iPod, a phone, and an internet communicator. He repeats it again and again until it clicks. These aren't three devices, it's one. And suddenly, the room shifts. Because people realize they're not looking at an upgrade, they're looking at a replacement. And the device itself, the iPhone, looks almost suspiciously simple. A slab of glass, a single button, no keyboard, no stylus, nothing to hide behind, just a screen that responds to your touch like it actually understands you, which at the time felt less like technology and more like magic. Because up until that point, interacting with devices felt like negotiating with a stubborn machine. You had to adapt to it, learn its language, memorize its rules. But the iPhone flipped that relationship. It adapted to you. You didn't need instructions. You just touched, swiped, pinched, and somehow it all made sense. And that's the part people underestimate. The technology was impressive, sure, but the real breakthrough was psychological. It removed friction. It made people feel competent instantly. And once you give someone that feeling, there's no going back, because suddenly every other phone feels broken, outdated, unnecessarily complicated, like trying to send a text on a device that thinks you're still living in 1999, and the reaction from competitors was almost predictable, a mix of disbelief and quiet panic. Executives dismissed it publicly, calling it too expensive, too limited, lacking essential features like a physical keyboard, which in hindsight is like criticizing a car for not having reins and a horse attached to it. But internally, they knew something had shifted, because Jobs hadn't just introduced a new product, he had changed expectations. And expectations are ruthless. Once people experience something better, they don't negotiate, they don't compromise, they demand it everywhere. And that's exactly what happened. Within a few years, the entire industry pivoted. Keyboards disappeared, touch screens took over, and every company that once felt untouchable suddenly found itself scrambling to catch up. Some made it, many didn't. And the iPhone didn't just change phones, it changed behavior. It turned the internet into something you carried in your pocket, something you checked constantly, something that blurred the line between online and offline until the distinction barely mattered. And just like with music, Jobs didn't invent the individual pieces. Touchscreens existed, mobile internet existed, phones existed, but he combined them in a way that made everything else feel obsolete overnight. And the entertainment industry? They were next in line, because once you put a powerful, intuitive, always connected device in someone's pocket, you don't just change communication, you change how people consume everything. Music, movies, news, games, every form of entertainment suddenly had a new battlefield, one that fit in your hand, followed you everywhere, and demanded to be filled. And just when Hollywood thought they still had control over how and where people watched their content, Steve Jobs was already thinking several moves ahead. Because for him, the iPhone wasn't the final product. It was the gateway, the beginning of a much larger shift, one that would quietly, relentlessly, and completely reshape the entire entertainment landscape, whether anyone was ready for it or not. And just when the world finally adjusted to carrying the internet in its pocket, something strange started happening. People weren't just using their phones to call or text anymore, they were living inside them. And Steve Jobs saw that shift before almost anyone else. Because to him, the iPhone was never just a device. It was a platform, a blank stage waiting for an endless cast of performers. And what it needed next wasn't better hardware or a slightly shinier screen. It needed an ecosystem, a controlled, elegant, slightly terrifying ecosystem where every experience flowed through one central gate. And in 2008, that gate opened with something that sounded harmless, almost boring: the App Store, which at first glance looked like a simple digital marketplace. Just a place to download little programs, nothing revolutionary, nothing dramatic. But in reality, it was one of the most quietly aggressive business decisions ever made. Because what Jobs did here wasn't just create a store, he created a new economy, a new distribution model, and more importantly, a new dependency. Because before the App Store, software distribution was messy, fragmented, unpredictable. Developers had to fight for visibility. Users had to hunt for programs like they were searching for a decent radio station in the middle of nowhere. But now everything lived in one place, curated, controlled, approved, and yes, taxed, because Apple took its famous 30% cut, which at the time sounded outrageous until you realized developers were suddenly making more money than ever because access had replaced scarcity and convenience had replaced friction. And just like with iTunes, Jobs understood something everyone else missed. People will accept almost any rule, any limitation, any commission, as long as the experience feels effortless. And the App Store was effortless, dangerously so, because it turned software into impulse purchases, into casual decisions, into, I'll just download this and see what happens. And suddenly your phone wasn't just a phone anymore, it was whatever you needed it to be in that exact moment. A camera, a game console, a navigation system, a social network, a TV, a casino, a therapist, sometimes all within the same hour. And this is where things start to shift from innovation into transformation. Because once you give people that level of flexibility, that level of instant gratification, you don't just change technology, you change behavior. Entire industries begin to reorganize themselves around this new reality. And the entertainment world felt it first, because apps didn't just complement traditional media, they started replacing it, slowly at first, almost politely, like a guest who overstays their welcome but keeps bringing snacks so nobody complains. And then suddenly, they were everywhere. Games like Angry Birds turning into global phenomena, social media apps redefining how people consumed content, streaming services realizing they no longer needed to rely on living rooms and cable boxes, because now the screen was always with you, always on, always ready. And the old guard, the studios, the networks, the publishers, they didn't see it coming, not really, because they were still thinking in terms of channels and schedules, in terms of prime time and air dates, while the App Store was quietly introducing a new concept: anytime, anywhere, on demand. And that phrase would become the most disruptive force in entertainment since the invention of television itself. Because once people get used to watching what they want, when they want, the idea of waiting becomes almost offensive, like being told you can only drink water at specific hours of the day. And this is where Jobs' influence becomes almost invisible, because he's not directly creating the content, he's not producing movies or shows, but he's building the infrastructure that makes the old system feel outdated, unnecessary, even inconvenient. And that's far more powerful, because instead of competing with existing industries, he's redefining the environment they operate in. And suddenly, success isn't about who has the best content. It's about who delivers it most seamlessly, most instantly, most intuitively. And Apple sits right in the middle of that shift, controlling the gateway, setting the rules, shaping the experience, and of course, taking a cut of everything that flows through it, which is the kind of business model that looks obvious in hindsight but felt almost audacious at the time, because Jobs was essentially saying, we don't need to own the content, we just need to own the door. And once you own the door, you decide who gets in, how they get in, and how much they pay for the privilege, and the ripple effects of that decision are massive, because it empowers creators while simultaneously binding them to a system they don't control. It gives users freedom while subtly guiding their choices through design and curation. It creates opportunity and dependency in the same breath. And perhaps most importantly, it accelerates the pace of everything. Because now ideas can spread instantly. Trends can explode overnight. Entire companies can rise and fall in the time it used to take to ship a physical product. And the entertainment landscape becomes faster, more chaotic, more competitive, but also more accessible than ever before. And through all of this, Steve Jobs maintains his signature approach: focus, control, simplicity. Because while the world around the iPhone becomes increasingly complex, the device itself remains deceptively simple, a glass rectangle that hides an entire universe behind a few intuitive gestures. And that's the genius of it, because complexity is pushed behind the curtain, handled by developers, servers, networks, while the user experiences something that feels almost effortless, almost natural. And that illusion of simplicity is what makes the entire system work, because people don't adopt technology. They don't understand. They adopt technology that understands them, or at least feels like it does. And by the time competitors fully grasp what's happening, it's already too late, because the App Store isn't just a feature, it's a foundation, a self-sustaining ecosystem that grows stronger with every new app, every new user, every new habit formed. And breaking that kind of momentum isn't just difficult, it's nearly impossible. And just like with music, just like with phones, Jobs has once again shifted the ground beneath an entire industry, not by force, not by domination, but by making the alternative feel outdated, inconvenient, almost absurd. And the most fascinating part is that we're only halfway through the transformation, because if the iPod changed how we access music, and the iPhone changed how we interact with technology, and the App Store changed how we consume content, then what comes next isn't just another product, it's something far more ambitious, something that doesn't just fit in your pocket but sits in your living room, stares back at you from your largest screen, and quietly begins to rewrite the rules of how stories themselves are delivered, experienced, and ultimately controlled. And just when it seemed like Steve Jobs had already reshaped how we listen, communicate, and consume digital experiences, he quietly turned his attention to the one place the old world still felt safe: the living room, that sacred territory of cable boxes, remote controls with too many buttons, and a programming schedule that treated your free time like a suggestion rather than a right. Because for decades, television had operated on a simple, almost arrogant assumption: viewers would adapt to it, not the other way around. You would sit down at a specific hour, watch whatever was on, endure commercials like a patient in a waiting room, and if you missed it, well, too bad. Maybe you'd catch a rerun someday, And somehow this system survived into the digital age, clinging to relevance like a fax machine in a law office. But Jobs saw the cracks, because once people got used to controlling music and apps on demand, the idea of scheduled entertainment started to feel absurd, almost insulting, like being told you could only check your phone between 7 and 9 p.m. And so Apple stepped into the living room, not with a dramatic takeover, not with some loud, disruptive announcement, but with something far more subtle, far more strategic. Apple TV, a device that didn't scream for attention, didn't try to replace everything overnight, but instead quietly asked a dangerous question. What if watching TV felt as simple as using your phone? And at first, the answer wasn't obvious, because the early versions of Apple TV were, by Apple standards, almost underwhelming. Limited content, cautious partnerships, a device that felt more like a hobby than a revolution, and Jobs himself even referred to it that way, calling it a hobby, which, coming from him, is like a shark saying it's just casually swimming near your boat. But beneath that modest framing was a much bigger idea taking shape, because Apple wasn't trying to compete with cable in the traditional sense. It was trying to make cable irrelevant, and that's a very different game, because instead of fighting for channels or negotiating time slots, Apple focused on the experience, the interface, the feeling of control, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, it began to change how people interacted with their biggest screen. Because now, your TV wasn't just showing you content, it was responding to you, syncing with your devices, remembering your preferences, turning into an extension of the ecosystem that Jobs had already built around you. And this is where things start to get interesting. Because the living room had always been a shared space, a place where families negotiated what to watch, where one remote controlled the experience. But Apple introduced a more personal dynamic, where your content, your apps, your preferences followed you from your pocket to your couch, blurring the line between personal and shared entertainment. And at the same time, the broader industry was undergoing its own quiet transformation. Streaming services were emerging, experimenting, testing the waters, trying to figure out if people were ready to abandon the old model entirely. And while Apple didn't invent streaming, it played a crucial role in normalizing the idea that your TV could be as flexible, as responsive, as immediate as your phone. And that shift in expectation is everything. Because once viewers taste that level of control, they don't go back. They don't tolerate rigid schedules. They don't accept limitations. They expect instant access, seamless navigation, and a user experience that feels almost invisible. And this is where Jobs' philosophy once again reveals its power, because he understood that the battle for the living room wouldn't be won by content alone. It would be won by simplicity, by removing friction, by making the act of watching something so effortless that the technology disappears entirely, and that's exactly what Apple TV aimed to do. To turn the complex mess of cables, inputs, and remotes into something clean, unified, almost elegant. And while competitors focused on adding features, piling on options, creating increasingly complicated systems, Apple focused on reducing, refining, controlling the experience down to its core elements. And that approach didn't just influence hardware, it influenced the entire entertainment ecosystem. Because now, content creators had to think differently. They had to consider how their work would be discovered, navigated, experienced within these new interfaces, where a single click or swipe could determine whether someone watched their show or moved on to something else. And suddenly, the power dynamic began to shift, because it wasn't just about what you created. It was about how easily it could be accessed, how seamlessly it fit into the user's environment. And Apple, once again, was sitting at the center of that environment, shaping the rules without necessarily owning the content, guiding behavior through design rather than force. And perhaps the most fascinating part of this transition is how quietly it happened. There was no single moment where cable collapsed or streaming took over. It was a gradual shift, a slow migration from one model to another, driven not by a single decision, but by a series of small, deliberate changes that collectively redefined the experience of watching television. And at the heart of that shift was the same principle that had driven Jobs from the beginning. Control, not in the sense of restricting users, but in the sense of empowering them, giving them the ability to choose, to navigate, to consume content on their own terms. And once that expectation is set, once viewers realize they don't have to wait, don't have to settle, don't have to adapt, The old system doesn't just become outdated, it becomes unacceptable. And that's the moment when disruption becomes irreversible, when the past can't compete with the present. No matter how entrenched it once was, and as the living room continues to evolve, as screens get smarter, content gets more personalized, and the line between devices disappears entirely, one thing becomes clear. Steve Jobs didn't just change how we watch entertainment, he changed what we expect from it. And expectations, once raised, have a way of reshaping entire industries whether they're ready or not. And just when it seems like the transformation is complete, like every screen is connected and every experience is optimized, the story takes another turn, because the next shift isn't about devices or distribution, it's about something far more subtle, far more powerful, the way stories themselves are created, packaged, and delivered in a world where attention has become the most valuable currency of all. And just when it seemed like every screen in your life had been optimized, simplified, and quietly taken over by the logic of Steve Jobs' ecosystem, something even more profound started to happen. Entertainment itself began to change shape, not just how it was delivered, but how it was created, structured, and even valued, because once distribution becomes effortless and access becomes infinite, the real competition isn't between companies anymore. It's between moments of attention, and attention, as it turns out, is brutally limited, ruthlessly selective, and completely unforgiving. And this is where the final layer of Jobs' influence reveals itself, because he didn't just build devices or platforms, he helped create an environment where content had to fight for survival in real time, where every song, every video, every show had to earn its place in a world where switching costs were essentially zero. And that changes everything, because in the old world, entertainment was about scarcity. There were limited channels, limited airtime, limited shelf space, and if you made it into that system, you were guaranteed an audience. Maybe not a huge one, but a stable one, a predictable one. But in the new world that Jobs helped accelerate, there is no guarantee, no safety net, no default audience, just an endless stream of options competing for a few seconds of someone's attention while they're standing in line for coffee or pretending to listen during a meeting. And suddenly, the rules of storytelling begin to shift, because you're no longer just competing on quality, you're competing on immediacy, on accessibility, on how quickly you can capture interest before someone swipes away. And this leads to a kind of creative evolution, where content becomes shorter, sharper, more engaging from the very first second, because there is no patience anymore, no tolerance for slow builds or delayed gratification. And while that might sound like a loss, like something valuable has been sacrificed, it's also an adaptation, a response to a new reality where the audience is no longer captive, no longer obligated to stay. And this is where the ecosystem Jobs built becomes both empowering and demanding, because it gives creators unprecedented access to audiences while simultaneously raising the bar for what it takes to hold their attention. And you can see this shift everywhere, in the rise of short-form video, in the way music is structured to hook listeners within the first few seconds, in the way shows are designed to be binge-worthy, to keep you watching episode after episode without ever feeling the friction of stopping. And all of this traces back in one way or another to the idea that content should be instantly accessible, instantly engaging, instantly satisfying, because that's what the platforms demand, that's what the devices enable, and that's what users have come to expect. And perhaps the most interesting part of this transformation is how it blurs the line between creator and consumer, because the same devices that let you watch, listen, and play also let you create, share, and distribute, turning audiences into participants, into contributors, into competitors in the same ecosystem. And this democratization of content creation is both exhilarating and overwhelming, because it means anyone can reach millions of people, but it also means millions of people are trying to reach you at the same time. And in that environment, attention becomes the ultimate currency, more valuable than production budgets, more influential than traditional marketing. Because if you can capture attention, you can build an audience. And if you can build an audience, you can build an entire business. And this is where the legacy of Steve Jobs becomes almost paradoxical. Because while he was famously obsessed with control, with curating experiences, with maintaining a high level of quality and consistency, the systems he helped create have led to an explosion of creativity, diversity, and unpredictability that no single company could ever fully control. And yet, the structure remains. The ecosystem still shapes behavior, still influences how content is discovered, consumed, and monetized. And this balance between freedom and control is what defines the modern entertainment landscape. Because while creators have more tools and opportunities than ever before, they are also operating within platforms that guide their choices, reward certain behaviors, and quietly discourage others. And this dynamic creates a feedback loop, where successful content influences what gets created next, which in turn shapes audience expectations, which then feeds back into the system, accelerating trends, amplifying certain voices, and sometimes drowning out others. And through it all, the underlying principle remains the same. Make it simple, make it accessible, make it immediate. Because in a world where everything is available, the easiest option often wins. And this is perhaps the most enduring lesson from Jobs' approach. Because while technology continues to evolve, while new platforms emerge and old ones fade, the core idea that simplicity drives adoption, that user experience determines success, that convenience can reshape entire industries, remains as relevant as ever. And as we move further into this era of on-demand, personalized, algorithm-driven entertainment, it becomes clear that the decisions made years ago about music, about phones, about apps, about the living room, weren't just about products. They were about setting expectations, about redefining what people consider normal, acceptable, even desirable. And once those expectations are set, they don't just influence one industry, they ripple outward, affecting everything from how stories are told to how they are valued, and just when it seems like we've reached the peak of this transformation. Like every piece of content is just a tap away, and every moment of attention is accounted for, there's still one final question left to answer, one final shift that ties everything together. Not just how we consume entertainment, but who truly controls it in a world where the lines between technology, media, and human behavior have all but disappeared. And now we arrive at the final question, the one that quietly sits behind every swipe, every stream, every late-night binge session where you promise yourself just one more episode, and suddenly it's 2:47 a.m. Who actually controls entertainment now? Because if you trace everything back, all the way through music becoming digital, phones becoming personal computers, apps becoming ecosystems, and living rooms becoming extensions of your pocket, you start to realize something slightly unsettling, something Steve Jobs understood long before most people were even aware of it. Control didn't disappear, it just changed hands, and not in the obvious way, not from studios to audiences or from companies to creators, but into something far more abstract, far more subtle, and far more powerful. The systems themselves, the platforms, the invisible frameworks that decide what you see, when you see it, and how easily you can access it. Because in the old world, control was visible. You knew who held it. It was the TV networks, the record labels, the publishers, the gatekeepers who decided what got made and what didn't, what aired and what stayed on the cutting room floor, and you could point to them, criticize them, even rebel against them. But in the new world that Jobs helped build, control is embedded in design, in algorithms, in interfaces that feel neutral but are anything but. Because every recommendation, every autoplay, every "you might also like" is a decision, a subtle nudge guiding your attention in a specific direction. And the genius, and perhaps the danger of this system, is that it doesn't feel like control. It feels like convenience. It feels like the world is finally adapting to you, giving you exactly what you want, when you want it, without effort, without friction, without even asking. And that's the trade-off. Because the easier something becomes, the less you question it, the less you notice the structure behind it. And Steve Jobs built his entire philosophy around that idea. Remove friction, simplify the experience, make everything feel intuitive, and people will embrace it without hesitation. And they did. We all did. We traded complexity for convenience, control for comfort, and in doing so, we stepped into a system that shapes our behavior in ways we rarely stop to consider. Because now entertainment isn't just something you choose, it's something that's presented to you, curated, filtered, optimized based on patterns you didn't even realize you were creating. And this is where the story comes full circle. Because Jobs didn't just change industries, he changed expectations. He trained us to expect immediacy, simplicity, personalization. And once those expectations are set, they become the standard by which everything else is judged. and anything that doesn't meet them feels broken, outdated, almost unacceptable. And that's the real legacy here. Not just the products, not just the decisions, but the shift in mindset, the redefinition of what it means to interact with technology and consume entertainment. Because now, we don't just want access, we expect it. We don't just want options, we demand them. We don't just want good experiences, we want seamless ones, invisible ones, ones that anticipate our needs before we even articulate them. And that expectation continues to drive innovation, to push companies to compete not just on content, but on delivery, on user experience, on how effortlessly they can integrate into your life. And yet, despite all this progress, all this convenience, there's an irony at the heart of it all, because in a world where everything is available, where every song, every movie, every show is just a tap away, the challenge isn't access anymore, it's choice. It's navigating an endless sea of options without drowning in it. It's finding meaning in a system designed for efficiency, and that's something no device, no platform, no algorithm can fully solve, because at the end of the day, the most valuable thing in this entire ecosystem isn't the content, isn't the technology, it's your attention, your time, your focus, and those are finite, limited, irreplaceable, and that's where the final shift happens. Because once you recognize that, once you see how the system works, you start to realize that control isn't just something held by companies or platforms, it's something you participate in. Something you influence with every choice you make, every tap, every click, every moment you decide to stay or move on. And that realization doesn't undo what Steve Jobs built. It doesn't reverse the transformation, but it adds a layer of awareness, a reminder that behind every seamless experience is a set of decisions, a structure, a design, and understanding that doesn't make the system less impressive. If anything, it makes it more so because it reveals the true scale of what was accomplished. How a series of bold, sometimes risky business decisions didn't just change individual industries, but reshaped the entire landscape of entertainment, turning it from something you scheduled your life around into something that fits effortlessly into every moment of it. And whether that's a triumph, a trade-off, or something in between is a question that doesn't have a simple answer. But one thing is certain. Steve Jobs didn't just change how we consume entertainment, he changed the relationship between humans and technology itself. And that relationship is still evolving, still expanding, still redefining what's possible. And as you put down your phone, or pick it up again in about 30 seconds, you're not just using a device, you're participating in a system that was carefully, deliberately, and brilliantly designed to feel like it was built just for you, even when it was actually built to change the world.